Imagine walking through a city that somehow forgot about itself. Streets where the shops have been shuttered for decades, playgrounds where the swings still creak in the wind but no children ever come, entire neighborhoods that feel like they exist in a completely different time from the gleaming new Birmingham rising just a few miles away. That contrast is real. It is happening right now, and today we are going inside 10 of Birmingham's most forgotten districts to figure out what went wrong and whether anyone is actually doing anything about it. Before we dive in, I want you to stick around until number 3 on this list, because what happened there is genuinely one of the strangest stories in Birmingham's recent history, and almost nobody outside the city knows about it. Let's start with number 10. Washwood Heath is the kind of place that gets talked about in council meetings and then quietly forgotten by the time everyone drives home to their nicer parts of the city. Sitting in the east of Birmingham, this district has been struggling with disinvestment for years. The housing stock here is aging, and while there are genuine communities trying to make things work, the infrastructure around them tells a different story. Roads that need serious attention, community facilities that have been stripped back through budget cuts, and a high street that has seen better decades. What makes Washwood Heath particularly interesting is that it sits right on the edge of areas that have received significant regeneration funding, which makes the contrast even sharper when you actually walk around and see the difference between what investment looks like and what the absence of it looks like. Number 9 brings us to Sparkbrook. Now Sparkbrook has a complicated story because it is a community with real energy and a strong cultural identity. But the physical environment around that community has been neglected for a long time. Parts of Sparkbrook feel genuinely left behind, with crumbling Victorian terraces that have been subdivided repeatedly over the decades, creating housing conditions that nobody in 2026 should be living in. The local economy has pockets of vibrancy, particularly around certain food and cultural businesses, but the broader economic picture is one of persistent deprivation. What frustrates residents and local advocates is that Sparkbrook is not some distant suburb. It is minutes from the city center, which makes the level of abandonment feel even more deliberate somehow. At number 8, we have Nechells. If you know Birmingham history, you know that Nechells was once a proper industrial heartland, full of factories, foundries, and the kind of gritty working-class life that built this city's reputation. Today it presents a different picture entirely. Large sections of Nechells feel genuinely emptied out, particularly around the old industrial zones where the factories are long gone, but meaningful replacement has been slow to materialize. There are pockets of new residential development, and Aston Villa's presence nearby gives the area some visibility, but significant chunks of Nechells still feel stranded between eras, not quite what they were, and not yet what they might become. Number 7 is Lozells, and this is where we start getting into districts with really layered and painful histories. Lozells became nationally known in 2005 for serious community tensions and violence. And while that chapter belongs to the past, the legacy of underinvestment that contributed to those conditions has never really been properly addressed. The physical environment in parts of Lozells tells you everything you need to know about how priority is allocated in this city. Vacant lots, derelict properties, a sense that the area has been managed but never genuinely invested in. The community here is resilient and diverse, but resilience should not be a substitute for actual resources. Coming in at number 6 is Handsworth Wood, or more specifically, the edges and pockets within the broader Handsworth area that tend to get lumped together when people talk about this part of North Birmingham. Handsworth has significant heritage, both industrial and cultural, as a place where Caribbean and South Asian communities built genuinely vibrant lives and businesses from the 1950s onward. But certain streets and pockets within this area feel like time stopped somewhere around 1990. Businesses closed and never reopened. Properties fell into disrepair and stayed that way. The pride that residents feel in their community's history runs up against the daily reality of an environment that says nobody in power cares very much about what happens here. Okay, we are at number 5, and this is where things get particularly interesting. Aston. Now, some of you will immediately say Aston is not forgotten. Aston Villa is there. There is investment happening. And you would be partially right. But here is what those headline stories miss. Walk away from the stadium area, get into the residential streets of Aston proper, and you will find one of the most striking examples of patchwork abandonment in any English city. Streets of council housing that have seen maintenance cut to the bone, local services that have been progressively withdrawn, a community that gets talked about in terms of what sport can do for it, while the actual lived environment of the people who live there day in and day out gets comparatively little serious attention. Aston is where the gap between the city's ambitions and its reality becomes almost physically visible. Number 4 is Erdington. Now, Erdington is interesting because it is not a small pocket or a back street. It is a substantial district in its own right with its own town center. And that town center is genuinely struggling. High vacancy rates in the retail area, a high street that has been hollowed out by the combination of online shopping and the loss of anchor stores, and a surrounding residential area that feels progressively more cut off from Birmingham's economic recovery narrative. Erdington gets discussed occasionally when politicians want to talk about leveling up or inclusive growth. But the on-the-ground reality for people living and trying to run businesses here has been one of sustained decline. What makes Erdington particularly poignant is that it once worked. It had a functioning economy, a busy town center, a sense of local identity attached to place. Rebuilding that is not impossible, but it requires the kind of sustained commitment that tends to evaporate after the press release. Number 3. This is the one I told you to wait for, Castle Vale. Castle Vale's story is genuinely remarkable for reasons that cut both ways. In the 1990s, Castle Vale was considered one of the most problematic housing estates in Birmingham, a vast complex of tower blocks and deck access housing built in the 1960s as a supposed solution to Birmingham's housing crisis, which over time became a concentration of poverty, crime, and despair. Then something extraordinary happened. A housing action trust was established, the tower blocks were systematically demolished, and the estate was rebuilt from scratch with community involvement genuinely baked into the process. For a period, Castle Vale became a national example of how to turn a failed estate around. The reason it makes this list is what came after. After the initial regeneration moment, the sustained investment and attention gradually faded, and parts of Castle Vale are now showing signs of slipping back. The physical environment improved dramatically, but the underlying economic conditions that create vulnerability were never fully transformed. It is a story about how regeneration without sustained economic development is ultimately incomplete, and Castle Vale is living through that lesson right now. Number 2 is Bordesley Green. Located in East Birmingham, Bordesley Green is a district that rarely makes the headlines, which is part of the problem. Consistent underinvestment over a long period has created a cumulative effect that is really only visible if you spend time walking around and talking to people who actually live there. The housing conditions in parts of Bordesley Green are poor. The local environment feels underfunded and overlooked. There is a strong community of residents who care deeply about where they live, but caring about a place does not substitute for the funding, the infrastructure investment, and the economic opportunity that transforms a neighborhood. Bordesley Green is the kind of place that reminds you that Birmingham's challenges are not confined to a few obvious spots, but are threaded through large sections of the city that simply do not have the visibility or the political weight to force their way onto the agenda. And at number 1, the most forgotten district in Birmingham right now, we have Druids Heath. Druids Heath is a large post-war housing estate in the south of the city that for many years represented exactly what happens when good intentions in urban planning go badly wrong. Like Castle Vale, it was built to address housing need and became over time a place associated with poverty and isolation. Unlike Castle Vale, it has not yet had its major moment of transformation, though plans have been discussed for years. Residents of Druids Heath have lived with the uncertainty of knowing their neighborhood is earmarked for significant change, while watching the years pass without that change fully materializing. The physical environment is stark, the planning situation is complicated, and the people who live there are caught between a place that is failing them and a future that keeps being promised but keeps being deferred. There is regeneration work happening and proposals in various stages of development, but for the families actually living in Druids Heath right now, the day-to-day reality is one of a district that feels genuinely abandoned by the structures of power that should be serving it. So what does this list actually tell us? Because I do not want to just do a tour of deprivation and leave it there, because that would be doing a disservice to the people in these communities. What it tells us is that Birmingham's challenges are structural and not accidental. These are not 10 places that randomly fell through the cracks. They are 10 places where the combination of post-industrial economic decline, decades of austerity, housing policies that concentrated poverty rather than distributing opportunity, and planning decisions that prioritize certain parts of the city over others has produced predictable outcomes. Predictable outcomes that were predicted by the people living through them repeatedly and not always listened to. Birmingham is also a city that has been dealing with enormous financial pressure at the local government level, which has constrained what is possible even when the will to act exists. The council's well-documented financial difficulties in recent years have made the challenge of sustained investment in struggling districts even harder to meet. But here is what I want to end on, because I think it matters. Every single district on this list has people in it who are doing extraordinary work to hold their communities together. Grassroots organizations, local businesses run on a shoestring, community leaders who show up every single day for their neighborhoods without fanfare or recognition. The story of Forgotten Birmingham is not just a story of institutional failure, it is also a story of community persistence in the face of that failure. And that persistence deserves more than occasional acknowledgement. It deserves to be backed up with real resources and real structural change. If you live in or near any of these districts, drop a comment below and tell me what I got right and what I missed. Because no YouTube script captures the full reality of a place, and I genuinely want to hear from the people on the ground. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who cares about Birmingham or about how cities treat their most vulnerable communities. And subscribe if you want more content that goes beyond the surface to look at what is actually happening in British cities right now. The next video is going to continue in a similar direction, and I promise it is going to surprise you.